The grid in LightWave is a visual reference for where you are in 3D space. If I zoom out a little bit, we can see the positive z, I'm just going to keep zooming out, negative z, negative x, positive x. So it gives us an idea of where we're at in 3D space, but we can also use it to measure. So if I wanted to know how far away the camera is, I could just come down to the lower corner and it tells me that my grid size is 1.64 meters, and I could measure each grid and I would know how far away from the origin the camera is just by visually, just by looking at it. Now, sometimes when you load objects up into layout, let me go ahead and pop over to Modeler, and I'm going to send this object over to layout. So let's send that over to layout. And this is a good example. If I take a look at the size of my camera to the object. Now this is a small object, but what if this is the world I'm and that's the size of the object that I'm working with? Well, I might not want to work with a light or a camera that's this big. Now, the thing to know is this is just a visual reference of the camera, and this is just a visual reference of the light. They're both just really points in 3D space. So the size of this distant light and the size of this camera really doesn't affect anything. It's just showing us visually where it's at. Now, if we want to change the size of our icons for our cameras and lights, we need to change the grid squares, the size of the grid square, because that's it's tied to that. It's what's determining the size of these icons. So if I go to D for display options and under grid square size, if I shrink that, see how it looks like the box is growing, but actually the grid is getting smaller, therefore the camera, and see I'm going to move the light in just so we can kind of see all of it. Okay, and let me zoom in. Okay, so the icons become smaller, which might make it easier to work with. Now, the smaller the grid square size, the more accurate you can move things. If you're ever trying to move an item and it's kind of blocky, it doesn't allow you to finesse where you're moving it, you'll want to reduce the grid square size and you can be more accurate. If you don't need to be as accurate and you want to move in bigger increments, you can just work with a larger grid size. Okay, so that's how you can change the grid square size in layout. You can also, with the grid type, you can also determine, well, how many grids do you want to work with? 100 by 100, 80 by 80, 10 by 10. It'll be a much smaller grid, but we'll go back to 80 by 80. And so we can adjust the grid square size here. Now in Modeler, if you want to adjust the grid, you just zoom in and out. So right now, each one of these grid squares is 50 millimeters, and if I zoom in, now each one of these grid squares is 5 millimeters, and if I zoom out, then now each one of the grid squares is 500 millimeters. So by zooming in and out, I can change the grid square size in Modeler, and in layout I need to go to D for display options, which is also found under edit display options, and you just go over to the grid square size and change it there, or you can come over to the view tab and under grid you can increase, decrease, which as you can see that's the open and close brackets for the shortcut key, or you can just type in the amount here. So you can do it right from the toolbar, or you can come over to D for display options and work with it here. But at the end of the day, just know that you're changing the size of the grid, and that's going to change the size of these icons, but it will not affect how the camera works, and of course the grid will never render. It's just a visual reference. So that's just a quick introduction to working with the grid and the grid square size.